As I said, we have a fantastic group of speakers today. We've got a new reality in the Middle East. It looks like the ceasefire, at least so far, is holding. And so we wanted to bring in the right mix of experts to deal with the situation as it exists today. I think you all know I'm not one for long introductions, so I will simply say that I am joined by Vice Admiral Kevin Donegan. Kid is a MEI Distinguished Military Fellow. He has a long and distinguished military career, including as the commander of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, the naval component of U.S. Central Command, and he's currently in Bahrain, where he was including for the Iranian retaliatory strikes. Alan Eyre is a MEI Distinguished Diplomatic Fellow. He is a longtime State Department hand and a former negotiator with the Iranians, and brought Alan on to tackle exactly that issue as we transition over to the diplomatic piece of all of this. And finally, my colleague Paul Salem, who is the former president of MEI, now a scholar, a senior fellow with MEI, mostly located in Beirut, but currently he is on assignment in South Africa. To all of you, welcome. It's wonderful to have all of you. Again, we've got a new reality, and there are different pieces that we need to talk about at this point in time. I'd like each of you to take just 7 or 8 minutes and give us some opening remarks, how you're thinking about the situation as it is right now, especially given your particular areas of expertise. Kid, why don't you start us off? Obviously, everybody is dying to make sense or to figure out and make sense of what happened during the course of this war. What's your sense, and where do we stand on the military piece of things now?
Well, thanks, Ken. Always great to be involved with a great group of fellows here at MEI in a very difficult situation. So the first thing I'll say about the military thing that's going on is, well, we have a ceasefire, and it appears to have taken hold. Initially, a rocky start, but that puts you in a unique place. It presents opportunity, and as one of my old mentors always told me, if you have one day of peace, that's something to build on, right? So one day, 1 hour, whatever, you just try to expand on that. Now, it's not complete peace in the Middle East. There's other issues and things going on, but in terms of this conflict, at least for the moment, we have a ceasefire that can be taken advantage of. So let me tackle the question that seems to have a tremendous amount of press attention and people's attention, and because it's a natural one, and that is related to the battle damage assessment at Fort Doe. Just to get that out of the way, and then I have, I think, some one other meaty thing that I'll talk about before I turn it back over. But in terms of battle damage assessment, first of all, it's as a military person, it's egregious to have a top secret document leaked in any way, shape, or form, and it's even worse when it's leaked in the middle of an event of such significance that's ongoing. It just adds complexity across the spectrum for all parties that aren't necessary to have been added. So I hope they sort out how that happened and potentially stop that things from happening. And then if you were to have a leak of any kind of some classified document, probably the worst thing you'd want leaked is a preliminary assessment, because in something as complex as the operation against Fort Doe or against a nuclear program like Iran's, you can imagine how complex that is. And so with that complexity, an initial assessment to determine things like what's the state of the things that are underground in Fort Doe, buried 80 meters deep, and have some kind of sense of fidelity on what happened to that equipment, or how well it's working, not working, what was there, what wasn't there. Think about the enormity of sorting that out. It's not like looking at a satellite imagery and then going, oh, okay, yeah, that building is destroyed. Even those are difficult, by the way. I've looked at many satellite PDA pictures and thought one thing and found out later another, because building could be destroyed, but then you find out actually the capability was over there 10 meters to the left or right. So the complexity there. Then when you look at things like Natanz, what's buried under there? What's the state of contamination of what's buried? Could they even get in there because of the contaminations? So now you think about the United States, the Israelis, and their penetration of intelligence, and you have to fuse all this together to get a sense of what's going on. And add one more layer to that. no one should think that with that level of focus on those particular sites, that our intelligence organizations don't have a handle on what went where. So there are known knowns and there's known unknowns. So I just wanted to say the complexity. So now my assessment, based on all that I've seen and heard, I would say that you have to look at Iranian's entire nuclear program as just that, a program. And I'd say the program that existed before has been destroyed. Now, are there elements, specific elements of it across and these elements include leadership, they include scientists, they include equipment, they include manufacturing processes, and then tying that all together. So are there elements of that and the actual uranium itself? So are there elements of that exist? Absolutely there are. But then the ability to pull that together isn't anything like what it was before this started because of all that was lost, right? And don't underestimate the significance of the people and leaders that were involved in pulling this together and their knowledge that they had and what that means. So the ability to reconstruct that over time is a very difficult thing to make because you don't know the impact of all those things yet. It will take significant amount of time to figure it out. So what will that mean? That means those things that are left are what the Iranians will negotiate with when they go to the table. I'll let someone else talk here about the negotiations, and they're going to negotiate hard to keep those things, whatever it is that's left. And we'll start to get a hint of that very early when we see on the front end of this what they let the international agencies that look at nuclear stuff are allowed to see or not see, or they start telling us what they say is somewhere when we already know different. So it'll become very apparent. So hopefully that kind of gets at the BDA piece. So this will take time to actually have an assessment on all of the above, and it's complex. But the process that existed before, this nuclear program that they had before, it's been destroyed. Set elements of that have some different level of existence, most likely, and we probably have a good handle on some of that, and others will take significant time for us to figure it out, or maybe we know. I'm not sure. So that takes us to the next stage in terms of the military. So where are we? We all know that when there's a ceasefire, how long those lasts are interesting. What's different here, though, is it's not like you can have a low-level person launch a ballistic missile at another, or launch an airplane that needs to refuel 3 times to get somewhere. So the odds of a rogue actor breaking the ceasefire in an event like this are less likely. That doesn't mean the more strategic decision makers won't decide that they don't like what someone did and reignite it, but there's significant pressure to get to the table, and I have a sense that they will. The question that's going to then come up is going to be, what are they going to negotiate about? So I just want to look at 2 quick things, Ken, and it only take me a minute here. In the military sense, when you look across the region, we're in a different environment now. You've now had Iran, and I'm going to use a term to call them a bully, because in the region they've been a bully. They have directly attacked with ballistic missiles Qatar, Iraq, UAE, and Saudi Arabia at different times. That says a lot. And by the way, there's been no retaliation from back the other way when those things have happened. So that sets an interesting precedent in the region. You probably throw Syria in there, but that was related to ISIS. So I don't know if you want to do that, but still, that's significant. And they've directly lashed out at the U.S., right? But I'd argue that we started that one. So we retaliated on the front end of that. So I'm not going to put that in there. So, and then if we look at this from the Iranian side, what have they done? Well, they have absorbed significant might of the Israelis. They've absorbed what the United States threw at them. They've attacked Israel directly with ballistic missiles. They've attacked at the U.S. They've attacked at Arab neighbors. And the regime is still there, and they're going to go to the negotiating table. So if you're the Iranian regime, you've done what you said you were going to do to your general public. You stood up to the evil United States and Israel. Your regime still exists. You're still in charge, and now you're going to go to a table, and so there is room for negotiation, is my point that I see, and it was set up by the military action. And I'll leave it with that. No, military actions don't solve the problems. You have to solve these things diplomatically, and this is what we'll see as time goes on. So that's what I have, Ken, for a kind of kickoff.
That's fantastic, Admiral. Yeah, perfect segue into Alan. And before I bring in Alan, let me just say that, at some point, I think it would be great to hear what you're picking up out there in Bahrain, what you're hearing in the Gulf. I think that's another important element we should bring into this. But Alan, the Admiral set you up perfectly. Give us your sense of Iranians, the negotiations, whatever else you think is important for us to think about.
Thank you, Ken. In terms of diplomacy, I was at an event yesterday, and I joked that, whereas when you're a diplomat, you have to be cautiously optimistic. Now that I'm retired, I can be wildly pessimistic. And in fact, when it comes to the chance of diplomacy working in this regard, unfortunately, I'm well in the pessimistic camp, and I'll explain why. Mona Yacoubian referred to the state of the region after this war as more Hobbesian. And I think that's exactly right. There's zero trust between any parties. I do think that the U.S. and Iran obviously will go back to the negotiating table, but it has always been the case that Iran took as a working assumption that the U.S. was seeking regime change. I think that's even more the case now. I think in terms of how Iran strategic thinkers look at the situation, for them, the U.S. and U.S. and Israel are logically equivalent. And so even though Israel will not be at the table, I think the Iranians assume that Israel has a virtual place at the table, and they're concerned about Israel coming back in. What this administration has done very well, and Rose Kalanick and I think Jennifer Kavanaugh had a great piece in Foreign Affairs today about this. They have certainly established the threat component, the force component that puts pressure on people to negotiate. Yani, if you don't do X, we will bomb you. We've established that. Conversely, as they point out, the flip side, the assurances side, is totally lacking. Yani, Iran is not going, just as the U.S. doesn't trust Iran, I don't think Iran trusts anything the U.S. is going to put forward. President Trump pulled out of JCPOA, and he green-lighted or didn't red light at an Israeli attack right before the 6 rounds of negotiations. So I think even if there is a return to diplomacy, and I assume there will be at least a perfunctory one, getting the pieces set in terms of providing assurances to both sides is going to be very hard. It seems to me the U.S. side sees diplomacy in this regard to an extent as reading off its list of demands and Iran saying yes because you won militarily. And I don't think Iran sees it that way. So a key variable is whether the U.S. moves its red lines in a way that's not seen by the Iranians as more triumphalist and more maximal. And I think both sides need to do a better job at diplomacy. Before this all happened, I would characterize the efforts by both sides as desultory. I mean, the U.S. was doing it every couple of weeks for like a couple of hours. I don't think the United States government brought the necessary bench strength and expertise to negotiations that it could have. And I don't say that for partisan reasons. I just think that regardless of how good a negotiator Steve Witkoff is, I don't think he had enough firepower diplomatically to give a good faith effort for a diplomatic solution, even if even if we were focused on that. The Iranians are very good at negotiations. Their team is battle tested. At Arakchi and all of them. So I think, yeah, they'll return to the table. I don't think Iran is going to be any more likely to show flexibility in its red lines. I'm assuming that the U.S. is certainly not going to be more lenient in terms of its red lines. And again, we're Americans, so we always see things through an American context. But to my mind, still the main driver, the independent variable in all this has been Israel. You know, we dodged a bullet in terms of when we attacked the 3 nuclear installations and Iran did a performative de minimis response. That could have gone very badly. But still, this is a dance between Israel and the United States, excuse me, Israel and Iran, you know, both for the time being. President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu are doing victory laps. They're claiming success. I think they're, you know, trying to reap political capital from it as much as they can. But, you know, time will pass, and this is my final comment. Regardless of what either leader says, Israel knows that a one-off kinetic act against Iran's nuclear infrastructure is insufficient if it wants to remove the Iranian capability to build a nuclear weapon. They don't have to rebuild their civilian program, right? If they decide to go to the nuclear for a nuclear weapon, they can say, well, we don't need to rebuild all this stuff. You know, we don't need to rebuild Fordo. We have lots of mountains. We have lots of earth excavators. They can build a new one, you know, so time's a function. And there was something President Trump said this morning. He said, he said, essentially, I've dealt with this issue for the rest of my administration. And after that, I don't care. He said it in a different way, but basically putting in place a lasting diplomatic solution to the very real threat of the Iranian nuclear program. Because let's draw a line under this. The only reason Iran has a nuclear power program is so it can surge for a nuclear weapon if it wants to. It only provides 1% of energy, right? There's no, I mean, there is a good reason to have a nuclear program, but that's not why they have it. So I'm not making excuses for the Iranian regime at all. They have a nuclear program because it gives them the option of getting a nuclear weapon if they want it. The question is, does this attack make it more likely that they'll want it? And as Bob Einhorn said in that New York Times piece yesterday, I think that's the case. I think we're more at risk now. And to close off with the same Hobbesian comment, I think the international anti-proliferation regime is so much more weaker than it is today than it was a week or so ago, because we've shown there's no correlation between expert assessment and military action. Israel didn't do this because Iran was, this wasn't a preemptive attack, right? So, and even though the U.S. intelligence community said to President Trump, we have no evidence Iran is moving toward a weapon, he didn't believe it. So the correlation between intelligence and policy, I mean, it's been severed before in the past, but it's severed again. With that, I'll close my initial comments.
Great. Thank you, Alan. All right, Paul, over to you. So first, you know, you were a longtime observer of the entire region. Would love to get your sense of where the region is. But again, you're a longtime observer of the entire region. So, you know, if there are other things that you'd like to point out, we're all ears.
Thank you, Ken. It's great to be with Kevin and Alan as well. Well, I think one thing stands out, that the rapprochement that Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and the Gulf countries did with Iran over the past few years, exactly to protect themselves from just such a war between Israel and Iran, or Israel and the US, I think from their perspective has worked. They were targeted in the past. They knew that if they had maintained hostile relations with Iran and there was a war like happened 12 days ago, they would have been decimated. So I think that policy has paid off, and they will double down on maintaining good relations with Iran. Obviously, throughout this crisis and during the US attack as well, they continued to message that, you know, they denounce these attacks, they want de-escalation, they want diplomacy. So I think on that side, that is rather clear. I think it's also been very clear that they are rather helpless or very vulnerable to these two regional powers, Israel and Iran, who have massive missile capacities, air capacities, and even with all of Israel's anti-missile defenses, it was really hit hard as well. So it, you know, it raises questions as to what their general security and defense policy is to protect themselves from risks in the future such as this. Turkey, interestingly, as well, I mean, had normal relations with Iran for a long time, so wasn't concerned about catching fallout itself. But interesting to see the commentary from Turkey, other than offering to mediate, as everybody has, going back and looking at their own missile capacities, their interest in what they're calling a steel dome, some kind of anti-missile defense system. So the whole, how do the militaries in the region learn lessons from all of this is important. When you look at the region as well, it has been the case that, maybe since let's say the 1990s, after the end of the Iran-Iraq war and the establishment first of Hezbollah and then other Iranian proxies, Iran has been able to maintain a deterrence against Israel and to pose as an effective regional power that can deter Israel and the US, that can project power beyond its borders, and certainly communicated that it did not feel that its homeland was at risk. Obviously, all of that has completely and utterly and irrevocably changed. Of course, what happens with a nuclear weapon is somewhat of a separate issue, but it's clear that Iran has had already lost any ability to deter Israel. The main deterrent force was Hezbollah. The second level of defense in terms of deterrence was its missile systems, and both proved that Israel was not deterred. That's partly because of the degradation of Hezbollah and Israel's defense shield, but it's also because by Hamas and Hezbollah attacking Israel, it made Israel much more of an angry player, willing to be bloodied, willing to take hits, but fight and try to fight to the finish. So Iran and its proxies, in the end, created a much more powerful Israel, a much more successful militarily Israel. If you go back to the mood on October 6, 2023, the general mood was, well, Israel is a startup nation and people are at the beach, and whereas Iran and Hezbollah were willing to, to die and take sacrifices. How that has changed. And that has utterly changed the balance of power. So also when you look at the region, Israel is the hegemon. There is no longer any doubt. Now, how does a hegemon translate that into political gains? That's a different question. The US was a hegemon for a while and certainly didn't get much out of it. But there's no longer any doubt that Israel can do militarily pretty much what it wants. And that gets me a bit to what might the readings be going forward. We have a ceasefire. My and some of the readings is how much of a ceasefire is this? I know President Trump is insisting that it be a clean ceasefire because he needs to message that back home. Prime Minister Netanyahu is in a very different position. He wants to maintain that it's not an equal ceasefire. He wants to maintain that he and Israel maintains air superiority over Iranian skies. Yes, it's distant and it's far, as Admiral Donegan said, but like the ceasefire in Lebanon, Israel made it a point to make it very clear that this is really a one-sided ceasefire. And if we see something worth going after, regardless of what the US says, we're going to do it. And so what kind of ceasefire will this prove to be in the weeks ahead? Will Israel pinprick and go after targets, scientists, other bases and so on? We have to see. And then how long will it last and what happens afterwards? I think that very much depends on what Alan was talking about. Yes, the Iranians will come to the table, but I share his view that, coming to the table is one thing. Getting to an agreement is something very different. And I don't think there's much illusion in the region that Iran is suddenly going to come and accede to demands which will be now more maximalist than they were 2 weeks ago. And I don't think that's something the Iranians will agree to. So really, when we're looking at where will we be, in August, September, October, you have the deadline of the snapback sanctions and all of that. There's a lot of worry down the road. And I think sort of to conclude that, if you step back from something very significant, that the balance of power has changed. Iran is not able to deter. Iran is not even able to defend its homeland. However, having said that, three other things. One, Iran is a fighting regime. They love the fight. They're primed for fighting. They can take blows and keep going. Now, Israel is sort of the same. They can take blows and keep going. They never had a nuclear weapon, so they had a nuclear program, so you can't say that they've lost they didn't have a nuclear weapon, they didn't use a nuclear weapon. So in a way, there's some aspects of the power distribution that have not fundamentally changed. A number of their proxies are weaker, but they still have most of those proxies. The Houthis are no weaker than they were. Hashd in Iraq is no weaker than it was. Hezbollah survives, but weaker, but it's there. The main flip probably was in Syria, and that's very significant. So it's still a very mixed picture in the region. And if you kind of zoom out to where we've been from October 7, 2023 till now, and you look at the 3 or 4 problem sets from within the region, you look at the Israel-Palestine problem set, that's worse than it was, 2 years ago. It's no closer to a resolution. I think if you look at the Levant, it is a positive outcome, potentially positive change in Syria, potentially positive change in Lebanon. That's a real potential flip. That's a real potential gain. No real change, in the Iraq kind of area. And vis-a-vis Iran, I would say it's a mixed bag. But I would also say that I don't think Israel is going to let its military advantage go to waste. And I would expect if there's no real major agreement or concessions from Iran, I think Israel will be back on the warpath soon, as it has been in Lebanon, and might convince elements of the Trump administration that, look, you tried, it's nice to try a negotiation, but this, we have to keep going. And I do think now the conjecture or the appetite for regime degradation, and which might eventually get into discussions not of regime change as a push button thing, but if this regime is not going to cooperate, I think the Israelis and some probably in the US might say, well, then they have to be further degraded and pushed towards some eventual change. It's no doubt that the regime is now extremely vulnerable over the long term. If it doesn't come to a deal and it continues to be battered, 4 or 5 years down the road, will it still be there? I'm not sure. I kind of liken it a bit to Saddam after, Kuwait, or Bashar al-Assad after 2012, 2013. They might last 5, 10 years, but I think they're on a downward streak. I'll end there. A lot of conjecture. Thanks, Ken.
Okay, that's great, Paul. I think it's a very nice tour d'horizon, a great start to the conversation. All right.
Hey, Ken, maybe I said one thing to the region piece, since I'm here in the Middle East and was here through this U.S. attack and beyond. The mood here, as much as Alan was pessimistic when he was talking about where he had to stand in his current position, the mood here, if you're an Arab nation, is different. It's I'm going to generalize because every one of these nations is different, and we all know that. But in a general sense, that there's a positive view that Iran's military is weakened. That's a big deal. They know that's a positive for them. And the other piece is they're the biggest thing that they saw that was a problem, of course, is the nuclear issue and Iran's having uranium enriched it over what's needed for commercial use and they believed that Iran eventually was going to do something with that. When or how, who knows. But having that on the world stage and talked about in the way that it is, so it's not just here a regional problem, that it's understood and brought to light, and have other nations, both Israel and the United States, move towards reducing that threat to them. They see that as a very positive thing too. Just wanted to throw those things out here. The other thing that you saw was significant in my mind, at least what was publicly put out there, of communication amongst the Arab countries. And you saw even even the leader of Saudi Arabia, MBS, communicating with the Emir in Qatar directly about as things were coming to that ceasefire point. So that was also interesting. It forced I don't know if it forced it, but those kind of communications were going on, and I would say that prior to that, that wasn't going to be the standard phone call either, and would be making to each other.
That's great, Kit. And don't go anywhere because we've got a whole bunch of questions that I want to put to you. So, as you and as Alan, as Paul all pointed out, the war, we've got a ceasefire, but that doesn't necessarily mean the military operations have ceased. As you guys have pointed out, Israel has incentives to restart military operations if they see Iran rearming as a way of putting pressure on Iran in the negotiations themselves, or if they believe that the negotiations may break down, right? So this is a very tentative ceasefire at the moment. And a number of the questions that we're getting are really about what the US military ought to be doing, posturing itself, concerned about. So let me put the question to you this way. Imagine that you were back in your old stomping ground you are back in your old stomping ground in Bahrain, but imagine you're the Fifth Fleet commander again, or if you prefer, imagine you're the CENTCOM commander. What are the big issues out there that would concern you at this moment in time as we start these negotiations, with the recognition that the threat of additional military operations, certainly by Israel, are still on the table? What would be your biggest concerns? What would keep you up at night? And what would you want to be doing about it?
Yeah, it's interesting you asked that, because I think the posture of our forces is as alert as it could be. So that would be the least of my concerns, because we were postured for worst case outcome just days ago, right? So you want to keep that posture for obvious reasons, because the threat didn't just go away, it still exists. But it's not likely now that U.S. Retaliation against the U.S. The bigger issue is going to be your relationships with your partners and in the region, and assuring them, of how the U.S. is going to interact with them in the future. I mean, I'd say that that's probably going to be, you're going to put force protection number one, and then number two, posturing yourself to be able to do whatever the president wants you to do. But it looks like, he's giving a lot of clear indications that he doesn't want to jump in right now. So now you're going to look at, you can't assume that we can then also give up our help in defending Israel, meaning if Israel to be attacked again. But I look at the greatest likelihood of this ceasefire being broken in the way that maybe the Israelis are looking at it, and that's the Israelis doing something, because they see, because as you can imagine, their intelligence agencies and organizations are laser focused on BDA, understanding the success they've had, understanding the success they have in areas maybe they haven't had. And the thing that could drive this is that they see something that they really want to get at. Maybe they didn't even know about it before, but they see an opportunity. That's going to be hard for them to turn down, given the posture that they have and their ability to get over the airspace. So I'm right with Paul on that. I think that is how they see it.
Outstanding. All right. Next question, again, a set of questions really for Alan. And again, these go back to the negotiations themselves. And there are two questions, but two sets of questions, but they're related. I'm going to pose both of them to you, Alan. I think it'd be great if you could tackle each of them. So the first one is, we've all talked about what the sticks are that the U.S. can bring to this. And as I just mentioned, in many ways, the sticks are Israeli military operations, but obviously we could join in them as well. Plus, we have the stick of our ongoing sanctions against Iran. But point number one, do you think that the administration should bring carrots? And if so, what should those carrots look like? And then a related question, but nonetheless separate, the inspections, right? I will say from my own perspective, I think that the inspections are the most important element of what gets signed. Because whatever gets signed, the real question is, can we keep the Iranians to that agreement, given that they now have incentives to go ahead and get a nuclear weapon as quickly as they can? So give us a sense on the inspection side of what you'd be looking for there, what you think would be acceptable in terms of new inspections moving forward. So carrots, what should we do? What's out there as a possibility? And then the inspections.
Okay, Again, without being facile, I think the main carrot for the Iranians is just a credible assurance of no further sticks. Okay, so they're not looking for U.S. investment. They're not looking for a Trump hotel in Tehran. They just want to make sure that there's no, to minimize the possibility of future military action against it by U.S./Israel. So that's crucial. And obviously lifting sanctions, right? Now, even before this happened, the Iranian economy was in horrible shape. Iran was facing serious chronic problems, providing for the needs of its people. That, electrical brownouts, blackouts, water shortages, inflation, unemployment, on any day after scenario, those problems are going to still be there. Plus, I have to assume they're going to be spending more of their budget toward militarization, rebuilding conventional missile capability, if not a covert nuclear weapons program. So, lifting sanctions would be crucial. You referred earlier to not the elephant in the room, but in the background, the possibility of snapbacks, right? If nothing happens, UN sanctions on Iran are lifted in mid-October. That's clearly not going to happen. So part of the U.S. diplomatic initiative is going to have to be figuring out how to kick that can down the road if there's progress in negotiations. In terms of inspections, I have to assume, given the putatively increased desire by Iran to covertly build a nuclear weapon, which we have to assume, we're going to need a really punishing set of inspection mechanisms by the IAEA, which heretofore Iran has been totally unwilling to accept in terms of, inspection of military facilities, certain types of areas where weaponization could happen. So I totally agree with you. An essential component of any deal in the unlikely event it's going to happen is an almost draconian regime of verification by the IAEA. And here again, I don't see any indication that Iran is going to play that, because their guiding ethos is that that type of capitulation is chum in the water, inviting further aggressions, because the one thing they don't want to do coming out of this is signal weakness as a result of these Israeli actions. I mean, we're already seeing in Iran, the official propaganda is, great victory for Iran. We forced a ceasefire. We forced Israel to back down. We forced the U.S. to do such and such, commemorating the military martyrs who lost their lives defending the homeland. So, all sides have already got their spin machine in place. And I think Iran's spin machine, it makes it much tougher that they'll agree to the type of verification regime that would be an essential component.
All right, we should come back to that one because I think that's a huge point. But for now, I've got several questions that go to Paul. And first one for you, Paul. You touch on at least half of this in your opening remarks in terms of how the region is reassessing where it is, and in particular, you talked a little bit about the rise of Israel, but got two related questions related to Iran. So first, if you could spin out a little bit more the change in the balance of power, right? Because it's not just that Israel has emerged; it's also that Iran has been weakened, right, as a result of this. And so how do you think things are going to change, in particular with the Gulf? I mean, you did point out that there was already this rapprochement, but the Gulf had been moving toward a much warmer embrace of Israel. Do you think that cools? How do things change there? And then a related question is, what's your sense, and if you have any sense of it, whether it's from the region or just you're watching them closely, do you think this has really changed Iran's own strategy toward the region, right? They have for 46 years had a very aggressive policy toward the region, subversion, support for all manner of violent groups, looking to dominate the region as best they could. Do you think that this war has changed their thinking about that maybe this isn't a good idea anymore?
Yeah, it's a bunch of related questions. And let me start with just also a couple of reflections. Just a couple of months ago, Trump was in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, and he snubbed Netanyahu and Israel. And the reading in the region was the U.S. relationship is now anchored in the Gulf and anchored mainly with Saudi Arabia, but also with the UAE and Qatar, and that Israel was somewhat on the outs. That was kind of, I would say, confirmed, at least while Trump was negotiating with Iran for those 8 weeks. And it seemed like that pattern was continuing since obviously Prime Minister Netanyahu was very upset about that. It was also the perspective that Donald Trump was the dominant figure in the relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu. Unlike President Biden, Trump was the alpha male and was calling the shots. He had sort of forced Netanyahu to a ceasefire in Gaza, ceasefire in Lebanon. He called off attacks on Iran. As we recall, that's what Netanyahu wanted to do early on. I think what has changed among the many things is that I think Prime Minister Netanyahu has gotten back into the driver's seat and ended up dictating U.S. policy, short-circuiting Trump's attempt at negotiation, launching a unilateral war, and effectively cornering, I wouldn't say forcing, but putting the U.S. in such a position that we've gone this far, you've got to do the rest. And I think that cornering situation will continue for the rest of Trump's term, because Iran, and I agree with Alan, they're not going to, take the beautiful Trump deal, the make Iran great again version of what Trump thinks. They're not going to do that for a myriad of reasons. One of the reasons is also Israel doesn't want a deal to happen. They don't want the Islamic Republic to have good relations with the United States. They think that's just a way that the Islamic Republic buys time, buys cover to doing nefarious things that eventually aim to destroy Israel. So I think the Israelis will have a major vote in scuttling these negotiations, making them virtually impossible, partly by raising the bar and raising the stakes politically, but also hitting and attacking different points in Iran and make it also difficult for the Iranians. So I think Netanyahu has sort of wrestled himself back into a very powerful position, and the Gulf countries feel, hey, wait a minute, we were telling Trump what to do just 2 months ago, and now we're kind of on the outs. I think another very important dynamic is the dog that did not bark, that the great Gulf fear that Iran would devastate the Gulf, close the Strait of Hormuz, really go all out, absolutely did not happen. Now that's very reassuring. That's great. What they did was less than what they did when Qasem Soleimani was killed. That's very interesting to know why that's the case. Does that reflect a new approach from Iran? And then I'll go there. But what I also fear is that continues to give Israel a free hand. Well, if Israel and the U.S. pounded Iran and Fordo and Natanz and Isfahan, and they basically did next to nothing, then Israel and maybe some in the U.S. say, well, let's once the negotiations kind of fail, let's then continue on that track, since there's even deterrence in the Gulf is kind of lost. I think in terms of what is Iran's strategy, obviously that's up to the Iranians to decide. There are some things that have happened to them. They cannot deter Israel anymore or the U.S. So all of those billions of dollars of investments, mainly in Hezbollah, but also in Houthis and others, thinking that that investment would spare the homeland, that's gone. That cannot be rebuilt. So how do they interpret that? Also, they cannot defend Iran. And I don't think Israel is going to allow them any pathway to rebuild a defense of Iran unless there is the great, beautiful deal with Trump. So I think they've lost that indefinitely as well. That leaves them with the tool sets that they still have. And that's what I sort of remarked, earlier in my comments, and obviously saying that all of this is a decisions they will make. We don't know what they're going to say, but I doubt that they will give up the measly tools that they have left. One could imagine they would give them up if they trusted the American side, or even if that's the way they wanted to play ball. They want to give up these proxies in exchange for a great deal with the United States, which will get them a great future. But I see nothing in their ideology, their political situation domestically, the rhetoric coming out of it, that would indicate what might be a logical deal, give up the Houthis and Hezbollah and others in exchange for great benefits. I just don't see that happening. So what I do expect is they're going to continue to invest in the Houthis and Hezbollah and the Hashd and Hamas to the extent that they can. And that, yes, it's not as effective as it used to be. It's certainly not going to be with the amounts of money that they used to spend before. But they are still tools, and they're the ones that they have, and I think they're going to stick to them. I do think what we're not considering is the major threat. For every Middle Eastern government, your main enemy or the main threat is your own people. I mean, regimes really have only fallen when something's happened domestically. And it's obviously hard to predict what's going to happen. But 40 plus years into this regime, which at least for a while it could claim it kept the homeland safe, after the Iran-Iraq war. Yes, the investments abroad weren't popular, but they kept the homeland safe. Iran was a major regional power, dominated 4 Arab capitals, had Israel cowed, had the US cowed. All of that is gone. The homeland has been attacked. It will be attacked again. All that rhetoric is no longer is making sense. I mean, yes, they have spin doctors and spin machines. So does Hezbollah. So does everybody on this planet. But people don't live on spin alone. The war has come to Tehran. And I know the appetites domestically, I think a lot of domestic players and regional, regions of Iran probably smell weakness, and that smell is correct. They are greatly weakened. And I also imagine the Mossad and other agencies, beyond what they've infiltrated, militarily, certainly are eyeing different actors either inside the regime that might stage an internal coup and take the regime in a different direction, or in the longer term, encourage domestic players to gradually weaken and, one day move against the regime. Is that a good thing? Maybe not. It might be, a failed state like many countries in the region. That's not necessarily a good thing. But this regime has really very few friends, and it's not doing well.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, we've got about 10 minutes. I'd like to squeeze in another round of questions to each of you. Admiral, you mentioned this before, and we now have several questions getting at this. It's kind of the other side of the questions I just put to Paul, which is, do you think that this war has changed the America's regional allies' approach to their own defense, right? Has it suddenly given them a sense that, yeah, we got to get on the ball because we don't want to be part of this, we don't want to be subjected to it? Has it pushed them in the opposite direction, led them to think that, we really don't need to do this because the Iranians are defanged, maybe the Israelis don't care about us? But, as I said, you mentioned this in your opening remarks, and we've had a number of people pick up on the questions. How do you think it affects Arab defense thinking moving forward?
Well, I don't want to speak for any of those nations directly, but this is what I would assess as a possibility that can happen here, or may even be happening behind the scenes. I don't know. But what we just saw is this confrontation, this conflict, and it went Israel and it went Iran and it had the U.S. in it, and the rest were sidelines, right? And even the defense of some of those nations wasn't where it would need to be if they were to be attacked, if it weren't for the U.S. that were in some of the places that they were at. So that's not lost on my sense on this administration, that's putting significant pressure on NATO nations to give more, right, to the defense for themselves. My sense is that it's likely the plan of this administration to do the same thing with the Arab nations, and it's not a function for some of them, in terms of dollars. It's for them to do a couple things. One is to get with what they have, not only to be able to defend, but potentially be able to deter, right? And to be able to deter, you have to have a capability to do not everything the Israelis did, but actually to get at the problem that's hurting you, right? In other words, you need a capability there. And most importantly, you need to be integrated with your other Arab partners because your power that you can pull together and the money that's spent on it far exceeds what the Iranians put into their budget. So the case isn't, hey, you're not spending enough on defense. It's you're not getting out of what you're spending, what you're putting into it. You're spending lots of money. You have all these tools. It's time to accelerate both two things. One, for Saudi's case, it's reforming their defense so it's much more effective, and the second is for the region to play together with each other and potentially even Israel in it, so that they can not only better defend themselves, but also as part of that defense, they can be a deterrent, right, to further action that the Iranians can take. So you're not just sitting there if the Iranians decide, and you're an Arab nation, and then you have to figure out how you're going to absorb, blunt a bunch of missiles that come at you without a counter proposal to that. So that's how I would hope they're looking at it, to be honest, because we've all wanted that, right? We wanted Arab defense by Arabs, but for a bit more, you want also Arab deterrence, right, against future things, and that's going to require an integration amongst the Arab partners, which I think the U.S. would be happy to lead, and in terms of helping to get there, and potentially, potentially in the future, Israel and Abraham Accords type things could make that part of it. But I think we're a ways from that, even as close as we were to getting to expanding the Abraham Accords before. Maybe we can get back that way. But those two outcomes are what I'd be looking for, Ken, and hopefully that's the lens that. I mean, this is an eye opener. The power that's been able to fly over those countries. I would think you're looking hard at your defense, and I would think that this current administration is probably going to make that part of, hey, we can't be your guarantor of security ad infinitum.
Great stuff, kid. All right, Alan, I'm going to do the same thing, ask you a really unfair question because it's big and it's hard, and we don't have all that much time to answer it in. There are a lot of folks in the questions more or less asking you to lay odds on what happens in the negotiations. Do we actually get a meaningful deal that keeps Iran from getting nuclear weapons, or do the Iranians go ahead and go for that nuclear weapon capability and detonate something at some point in the not too distant future? You're welcome to lay your own odds on that. But maybe another way to handle it would be, what do you think will be the key questions, the key issues that are likely to decide which outcome we end up with?
I'm perfectly comfortable giving odds. It's not like I have to pay off if I'm wrong. I would say the odds are less than 20% that the two sides will come to a diplomatic solution, maybe like 15%, 15 to 20. Diplomatic solution that credibly takes away the threat of an Iranian nuclear weapon. Okay? And again, as my colleagues on the panel today have said, the key driver is not the US, it's Israel. Because regardless of what the United States wishes, and again, unfortunately, I have to refer to, I think, the lack of sustained attention, the sort of ADHD attention span of the current administration, that I think might prevent it from dedicating sufficient attention, time, and resources to optimally address this issue. Okay? But even if we do, even if we make this priority number one, then again, as others have said, it's all Israel's battle damage assessment. When Netanyahu was Prime Minister, Netanyahu was speaking, he said, we want to get rid of Iran's nuclear program, missile program, axis of terror. And as he said, and as the defense minister said, we want to, basically rid ourselves of this troublesome regime, right? I mean, I don't know if they explicitly use the word regime change, but they basically said regime degradation, take away Iran's ability to project power outside its borders and make it so feeble that even if it wanted to cause trouble, it couldn't. So there's going to be a delta between Israeli strategic goals on Iran and the U.S. strategic goals on Iran, I think. And as Paul said, I think Israel's, driving the train on this. So Yeah, hope I'm pleasantly surprised. Lord knows I've gotten enough wrong so far in the last 12 days that I could be wrong again. But I think the prospects for successful diplomacy are slim. And again, just to draw a line to it, because I don't think Iran trusts anything the U.S. says, and I think rightly so, the U.S. is going to insist on some type of verification that the Iranians just can't swallow. Over.
No. Okay, Paul, I want to end on this note because again, we've got several questions about this, and I think they're perfect for you and perfect to end on, which is, do you think that the war has created more of an opportunity to resolve the issues both with Gaza and with Lebanon moving forward? And if you had the proverbial, I can't even give you the proverbial 5 minutes with the president, I'll give you the proverbial 2 minutes with the president. What would you tell him that we should be doing to help address the problems in both Gaza and Lebanon after the war?
I don't think the problem set with Gaza has really moved as a result of this war. And I would say, I mean, the short version is I don't think Prime Minister Netanyahu, especially a victorious and empowered Prime Minister Netanyahu, can bring home a deal that would, end the war in Gaza, find a pathway on the West Bank, normalize with Saudi Arabia, and really, even from an Israeli perspective, get Israel where it needs to be, a more sustainable, stable situation in Gaza and the West Bank with the Arab countries in a secure and normalized situation. I don't think there's a pathway that Netanyahu can take, and it's not helped or hindered by what happened in Iran, other than Netanyahu has proven that he is the boss. It wasn't even, we thought it was Trump for a while. I think that's not the case. I think it makes, I mean, Lebanon is a different issue. The situation is much more positive there. But I think Hezbollah will continue to be urged by the IRGC not to give up its weapons, to be as troublesome as it can. Why should Iran give it up, since it's not going to get to some great deal with the Americans whom they don't trust? And while the Lebanese state and the army is proceeding with disarming Hezbollah in the point south of the Litani, Israel is not making it any easier. If anything, it is helping Hezbollah in Lebanon by continuing to occupy 5 points inside Lebanon, by bombing every other day, and making it clear to everybody in Lebanon that no, the Lebanese state cannot bring security to Lebanon. And so Hezbollah says, you see, the state can't do it, so we've got to keep our arms. So unfortunately, while the situation in Lebanon is way better than it is, obviously nothing to compare with Gaza, but I don't think Prime Minister Netanyahu can bring it home. He's done a lot of things that have changed the Middle East, some terrible ways, some very good ways. And I will end by saying, since we are talking about, the situation in Iran as an ending point, Israel is at war with Iran. This is not, I mean, it's a ceasefire. Trump likes to call it peace. We are at war. It's a little bit of a lull. Israel needed the lull to replenish its anti-missile defense system. It was worrisomely low. They need their battle assessments, but they're gearing up for the next round of attacks. They don't expect a deal. They don't want a deal. And I think what's positive about that in the last 40 years, Iran has built up its proxies in various Arab countries, and it had gotten the US and Israel to play shadow boxing, and Israel and the US would just hit the shadows, hit Yemen, hit Lebanon, and would never hit the decision maker, which is Iran, which made it very problematic. I think there's a good thing that the person who's calling the shots in Tehran now has to pay the bill. But that will only work if bills continue to pile up. If this is the end of it, then they say, okay, that was a rough 12 days. But if this is behind them, then we don't have a path forward. I think that's what the Israelis are thinking, and I would say that's not far from the logic that they would need to follow.
Terrific. Well, thank you, all three of you. I mean, this has been a fantastic conversation. obviously lots more to be said, but I think that you've helped all of us start to understand the situation now and where we're headed in the future. A quick programming note for everyone watching: we're going to be doing a special session tomorrow of our regular Thursday webinars at 11 a.m. Washington time. We're going to have Ambassador Ryan Crocker, Shalom Lipner of Israel, and Mohsen Malani, Iran expert, to again talk about the negotiations and how to move them forward. So you're welcome to join us. We will be on the record and open to the public tomorrow at 11 a.m. Washington time, back here on the Middle East Institute website. Admiral, Alan, Paul, you've been fantastic. Thank you guys so much.